Kim Minho took a deep breath as the airlock doors hissed open. The neutral trading station stretched out before him like a metallic cathedral, its corridors bustling with dozens of alien species going about their business. Traders, diplomats, merchants, all moving with the casual confidence of beings who belonged among the stars. Minho tried not to feel like the outsider he clearly was. His team of 12 humans walked behind him in perfect formation, their black and silver earth, defense uniforms crisp and spotless. They had practiced this entrance 100 times back on Earth, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of stepping into a galaxy where humanity was just another primitive species begging for recognition. The message from the Vrexani Empire had been brutally simple. 3 sentences that had changed everything for Earth's 7 billion people. Submit to our rule, serve as our workers, or watch your world burn from space. Minho had volunteered for this mission, knowing it might be humanity's last chance at survival. Behind his confident smile, his heart hammered against his ribs. Everything depended on the next few hours. The station's central meeting chamber was massive, designed to accommodate beings of vastly different sizes and environmental needs. Atmospheric processors hummed quietly, adjusting the air mixture for each species present. Gravity generators created comfortable zones for creatures who had evolved on worlds with different conditions than Earth. Then she arrived, Queen Tharavel's transport pod was a work of art. Organic curves that seemed grown rather than built, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. When the pod opened with a sound like breaking glass, Minho had to consciously keep his jaw from dropping. The Vrexani queen was beautiful in the way that deadly things often are. Her body was covered in what looked like living crystal, each facet catching and reflecting the chamber's lights in impossible ways. She moved with fluid grace despite her size, nearly 3 meters of elegant, terrifying predator. Her 4 amber eyes focused on the human delegation with the kind of attention a scientist might give to interesting bacteria. There was no warmth. There, no curiosity, just cold calculation and barely concealed disgust. Other species in the chamber fell silent as she approached. Minho noticed how even the station's security personnel, themselves members of various warrior races, stepped aside respectfully. The Vrexani Empire commanded fear throughout this part of the galaxy, and their queen was the living embodiment of that power. "So, these are the famous humans," Queen Tharavel said, her voice carrying clearly despite the alien structure of her throat. The station's translation system rendered her words in perfect English, but somehow retained the contemptuous tone. "I expected more from the species that claims dominion over an entire world." Minho felt his team tense behind him. They had all heard the stories about first contact scenarios gone wrong. Species that had said the wrong thing, shown weakness at the crucial moment, and found themselves enslaved or extinct within a generation. He forced his diplomatic smile to remain steady, drawing on years of training in Earth's most dangerous negotiation rooms. "Your Majesty, we come seeking peaceful coexistence between our peoples." The Queen's mandibles clicked in what the translation system identified as amusement, though it sounded more like breaking bones to Minho's ears. She began to circle the human delegation slowly, studying them like a predator evaluating potential prey. "Peaceful coexistence," she repeated, savoring the words. "How quaint. Tell me, little human, what makes you think your species deserves such consideration from the Vrexani Empire?" Queen Tharavel moved to the center of the chamber, where a massive holographic projector hummed to life. The display materialized slowly, showing the familiar blue and green sphere that every human recognized instantly. Earth hung there in the artificial space, rotating peacefully, completely unaware that its fate was being decided light years away. "Your world," the Queen said, gesturing with one of her 4 arms toward the projection. Her crystalline fingers traced the outline of the continents as if she were already planning how to divide them. "Look at it. So much water, so much fertile. Land going to waste under the control of a single primitive species." Minho felt his stomach drop as he watched the Queen study his home world like a piece of property. The hologram was incredibly detailed. He could make out weather patterns, city lights on the night side, even the orbital stations that humanity was so proud of. To the Vrexani, those stations probably looked like toys. your world will make a suitable agricultural colony, Queen Tharavel continued, her tone casual as if she were discussing the weather. The soil composition is ideal for growing several crops that the Empire requires. The climate zones will support multiple harvests per cycle. Yes, very suitable indeed. She turned back to face the human delegation, and Minho could see his own. Reflection multiplied in her amber eyes. Your people will serve the Vrexani as laborers. You are physically capable, and your short lifespans mean you will not require long-term resource allocation. This is generous. Most species we simply eliminate. The casual way she discussed the enslavement of humanity made Minho's blood run cold. Behind him, he heard one of his team members take a sharp breath. These weren't empty threats. The Vrexani Empire had a reputation built on the bones of civilizations that had refused their offers. Dr. Park Jiwon stepped forward, her hands clasped behind her back in the formal posture they had practiced. As Earth's leading xenobiologist, she had studied every scrap of information available about the Vrexani. If anyone could find common ground, it would be her. Your Majesty, she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances, surely there's room for negotiation here. Humanity has much to offer as partners rather than subjects. Our scientific advances, our cultural diversity, our problem-solving capabilities. These could benefit the Empire far more than simple manual labor. Queen Tharavel's mandibles clicked again, but this time the sound was sharper, more aggressive. Her chittering laugh echoed through the chamber like breaking glass, causing several of the other alien observers to back away nervously. Partners, she repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. You believe your primitive species could be partners to the Vrexani Empire? Let me educate you about your place in the galaxy, little human. The holographic display shifted, showing images that made Minho's heart sink. Earth's military forces looked pathetic compared to what appeared on screen. Vrexani warships that dwarfed humanity's largest vessels, weapons that could crack planets, armies that numbered in the billions. You wage war with primitive chemical explosives and metal projectiles, the Queen continued, gesturing dismissively at the human weapons shown in the display. Your most advanced fighters use combustion engines. Your soldiers carry individual firearms that fire physical ammunition. How quaint. She zoomed in on one of Earth's proudest achievements, the International Space Station. Next to a Vrexani patrol craft, it looked like a child's toy made of tin cans and wire. Your largest vessels barely qualify as patrol craft by our standards, Queen Tharavel said, her amusement evident. What could you possibly offer the Vrexani Empire that we could not simply take by force? Minho exchanged a quick glance with Colonel Lee Sujin, his military advisor. They had prepared for this moment, knowing that humanity's technological disadvantage would be obvious to any advanced species. But they had one thing the Queen might not expect. They weren't ready to give up without a fight. Time, Minho said simply, meeting the Queen's four-eyed gaze without flinching. Give us time to consider your offer. The chamber fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the station's systems. Other species present watched the exchange with the fascination of beings witnessing a historical moment, the last negotiation between a doomed species and their conquerors. The emergency session at the United Nations had been going for 18 straight hours, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. President Choi Dae-ho sat at the head of the massive circular table, watching as representatives from every major nation shouted over each other in a dozen different languages. The translation systems were working overtime, but the message was clear in any language: panic. We should surrender immediately, the French representative was saying, his face pale with exhaustion. If we resist, they'll kill everyone. At least as slaves, we survive. Surrender is not an option, countered the Brazilian delegate, slamming her fist on the table. We fight with everything we have. Better to die free than live in chains. Fight with what? The Russian minister's voice cut through the noise. Our best warships are toys compared to theirs. Our nuclear weapons probably can't even scratch their hulls. This isn't a war, it's suicide. President Dae-ho listened to the arguments with growing frustration. These were smart people, experienced leaders, but they were thinking like politicians when what humanity needed was something else entirely. His eyes drifted to the corner of the room where General Kang Mirai sat quietly, her fingers dancing, across a tablet that most people assumed was for taking notes. They were wrong. General Mirai had been preparing for this day for over a decade. Not an alien invasion specifically, that had been science fiction until yesterday, but the possibility that humanity might face an enemy so overwhelming that conventional military thinking would be useless. She had spent years studying every guerrilla war, every resistance movement, every desperate last stand in human history. Her tablet wasn't connected to the UN's network. Instead, it linked directly to a communication system that existed in the shadows, known only to a select few. Military leaders around the world. As the politicians argued about surrender terms, Mirai was activating something that would change everything. Captain Nam Sung-hoon leaned close to her ear, his voice barely a whisper. "Ma'am, Sleeper Protocol 7 is active. All assets are responding." Mirai nodded without looking up from her tablet. Across the globe, coded messages were being received by people who had been waiting years for this moment. Retired soldiers, former intelligence operatives, military contractors who had signed agreements they couldn't discuss with their own families. They were waking up now, checking equipment that had been hidden in storage facilities, safe houses, and private bunkers for years. The sleeper protocols weren't about conventional warfare. They were about something much older and more human, the art of making an enemy's victory so costly that they would regret ever starting the fight. "Status report," Mirai whispered to her aide. 80% of primary assets confirmed active, Sung-hoon replied, reading from his own secured device. "Secondary networks are coming online now. The lunar mining stations are requesting equipment specifications." Mirai allowed herself a small smile. The Vrexani had studied human conflicts, but they had made a critical error. They had focused on the big wars, the ones with clear battle lines and uniformed armies. They had studied World War II and the Korean War, but they had missed Vietnam. They had analyzed the Gulf War but ignored Afghanistan. More importantly, they had completely overlooked humanity's greatest talent, the ability to learn from every defeat and come back stronger. Humanity's greatest secret wasn't their weapons or their technology. Those were obviously inferior to what the Vrexani possessed. The secret was their ability to adapt, to fight dirty, and to never surrender even when facing impossible odds. Every war in human history had been a teaching moment, and humanity had been very good students. The Vrexani had studied human conflicts, but missed the crucial detail that every war had taught humanity new ways to survive, to resist, and when necessary, to kill efficiently and creatively. "Ma'am," Sung-hoon whispered again, "we're getting confirmations from assets in over 40 countries. The mining colonies on Mars and the Moon are ready to implement Protocol 7 modifications. Even the civilian shipping companies are reporting readiness." President Daeho was still listening to the panicked arguments when his secure phone buzzed. General Mirai had sent him a single message. Ready. The politicians could debate surrender all they wanted. Humanity had already chosen a different path. The alarm sirens across Earth fell silent as 200 alien warships materialized at the edge of the solar system like deadly stars appearing in the darkness. Admiral Yoon Kyungmin stood on the bridge of the ESN Defiance, humanity's flagship, watching the tactical display with the calm expression of a man who had already accepted his fate. "Sir, we're detecting massive energy signatures," reported his communications officer, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Their smallest vessels are 3 times the size of our largest battleships." Kyung-min nodded grimly. Earth's entire space defense force consisted of 30 operational warships, destroyers, frigates, and cruisers that had been built for fighting other humans, not an alien empire that treated entire star systems as their personal property. It was like bringing pocket knives to a gunfight, except the other side had nuclear weapons. "Fleet status?" he asked. "All ships report ready for combat, sir. Weapons charged, shields at maximum power." The tactical officer paused, then added quietly, "Sir, the odds are—" "I know the odds, Lieutenant." Kyungmin cut him off gently. "We all knew this was a one-way mission when we volunteered for it. The the human fleet moved into formation, their ships looking tiny against the backdrop of space. Behind them, Earth hung like a blue jewel, completely defenseless except for these 30 vessels and the brave souls who crewed them. Queen Tharavel observed the approaching human fleet from her command throne, her 4 amber eyes reflecting the tactical displays that surrounded her. Her flagship, the Eternal Dominion, was larger than most space stations and carried enough firepower to crack continents. The human fleet approaching her looked like insects attacking a giant. "Your Majesty," her weapons commander reported, "the humans are moving into an attack formation. Should we open communications and offer them a chance to surrender?" "No," the Queen replied, settling back into her throne with something resembling amusement. "Let them have their moment of futile heroism. It will make excellent propaganda footage for the other primitive species in this sector." The battle began with a coordinated human assault that was both desperate and beautiful. Admiral Kyungmin had trained his captains well. They moved like dancers, using every trick they had learned from decades of war games and theoretical combat scenarios. They targeted the smaller Vrexani vessels, hoping to prove that human ingenuity could overcome superior technology. For exactly 17 minutes it looked like they might succeed. Human missiles found their targets. Energy weapons scored hits on alien hulls, and 2 Vrexani patrol craft actually exploded in brilliant flashes that gave Earth's defenders a moment of hope. Then the aliens stopped playing. The real Vrexani. Weapons came online. Energy beams that could slice through human ships like paper. Missiles that could track targets through hyperspace, and defensive systems that made human attacks bounce off like raindrops. The ESN Defiance lasted longer than most, mainly because Admiral Kyungmin kept her moving in unpredictable patterns, while his crew fought with the desperate courage of people defending their home. Hull breach on decks 7 through 12, his damage control officer reported as another alien beam tore through their ship. "We've lost main engines and half our weapons systems." "Keep firing," Kyungmin ordered, his bridge shaking around him as another hit connected. "Make them work for it." The space battle lasted 4 hours, but only because the Vrexani were methodical in their destruction. They could have ended it in minutes if they had wanted to. Instead, they picked apart the human fleet piece by piece, studying their tactics, learning their capabilities. Queen Tharavel watched the last human destroyer explode in a flower of flame and debris. "Pitiful," she observed, her voice carrying across the bridge to her assembled officers. Their courage was admirable, but courage without power is merely expensive suicide. She gestured to her invasion commander. "Begin planetary bombardment of military targets. I want their communication networks, their missile silos, and their command centers eliminated within the hour. Then prepare landing forces for occupation duties." The first wave of Vrexani dropships launched toward Earth. Like falling meteors, their shields glowing as they hit the atmosphere. Queen Tharavel expected to find human armies waiting for them, defensive positions prepared around major cities, desperate last stands at government buildings. Instead, something unprecedented happened, something that no Vrexani tactical manual had prepared them for. The humans simply vanished. Major Ko Jae-hyun pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of the subway tunnel, listening to the heavy footsteps of Vrexani soldiers moving through the streets above. Through the metal grating that separated the underground from the surface world, he could see the shadows of alien boots passing by every few minutes. The creatures were methodical, searching every building, every alley, every possible hiding place for the human resistance they expected to find. They had no idea that the resistance was literally beneath their feet. Jae-hyun's team consisted of 40 volunteers who had answered the call 3 years ago when General Kang Mirai had quietly begun recruiting civilians for a program that officially didn't exist. They weren't soldiers, at least they hadn't been, before the training began. There was Kim So-young, who had taught 3rd grade for 15 years before learning how to make explosives from household chemicals. Park Dong-hwan had been a car mechanic, but now he could disable alien technology with tools from his own garage. Lee Hye-jin had run a small restaurant, but her real talent turned out to be reading enemy movement patterns and predicting patrol. "Rote's status report," Jae-hyun whispered into his communication device, keeping his voice so low that even his own team had to strain to hear him. Grid 7 reports all clear, came the response from across the city. The bugs walked right past the Namsan tunnel entrance. They don't even know we have a secondary network down here. Seoul's subway system had been Jae-hyun's idea. The aliens had studied human cities from orbital surveillance, but they had focused on the surface structures, the buildings, the roads, the obvious military installations. They had no idea that beneath Seoul lay hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, maintenance shafts and forgotten construction passages that had been connected and modified over the past 3 years. Phase 2 is go, Jae-hyun whispered into his comm device. Across the city, 40 similar teams received the same message and began emerging from their hiding spots like ghosts materializing from the shadows. The Vrexani had conquered 47 worlds using the same basic strategy. They would arrive with overwhelming force, challenge the local military to honorable combat, achieve quick victory, and then accept the surrender of the defeated population. It was efficient, predictable, and had worked perfectly for over 2 centuries of expansion, but they had never faced an enemy that refused to play by the rules of war. In London, a group of apparent refugees approached a Vrexani patrol with their hands raised in surrender. The aliens, trained to accept capitulation from defeated populations, lowered their weapons and began processing the humans for transport to holding areas. What they didn't know was that these refugees had been practicing this exact scenario for months, and the building they were standing in front of had been carefully modified to become a trap. When the explosives detonated, the blast was channeled by precisely placed charges that brought down the entire structure in a controlled collapse. The Vrexani patrol was buried under tons of concrete and steel, while the human refugees escaped through tunnels that had been dug specifically for this purpose. In Cairo, a different kind of warfare was taking place. Here, the humans had turned the city's own infrastructure into a weapon. Dr. Hassan Mahmoud, a former civil engineer, had spent 2 years learning every pipe, every cable, every system that kept the ancient city functioning. When the aliens tried to establish a command post in the city center, they found that the building's electrical systems had been modified to deliver lethal voltage. The water pipes had been rerouted to flood critical areas, and the elevator shafts had been turned into vertical killing fields. The Vrexani found themselves fighting not an army, but an entire species that approached warfare like a science. Every tactic they tried was countered by humans who had studied their methods and prepared specific responses. Every position they took was undermined by saboteurs who knew the cities better than the aliens ever could. Back in Seoul, Jae-hyun watched through his periscope as confused Vrexani soldiers tried to understand what was happening to their forces. They were used to fighting honorable enemies who stood and fought in the open. Instead, they found themselves dying in 1s and 2s, picked off by snipers who fired from impossible angles and then vanished into passages that didn't appear on any map. "Sir," one of his volunteers whispered, "patrol coming down Tunnel 7. Jae-hyun smiled grimly. The aliens were finally learning that the real battle wasn't happening on the surface at all. Captain Shin Yoonji crawled through the narrow maintenance tunnel beneath Tokyo's Shibuya district, her knees scraping against the concrete. As she led her team toward their target, behind her, 5 other humans moved in complete silence, their movements synchronized after months of practice in these underground passages. Above them, the sound of alien boots echoed through the streets as Vrexani patrols continued their methodical search for the human resistance. The irony wasn't lost on her. The aliens controlled every building, every street corner, every visible piece of Tokyo. They had set up checkpoints at major intersections, established command posts in government buildings, and posted guards at every location they considered strategically important. From their perspective, they owned the city. They were completely wrong. "Target approaching," whispered Lee Mingyu, her communications specialist, pressing his ear to a small device that picked up vibrations from the surface. "Supply convoy, 6 vehicles, moving east on Route 246. Yoonji checked her watch. The Vrexani were nothing if not punctual. Their supply runs happened exactly every 8 hours, following the same routes with the same security protocols. It was the kind of predictable behavior that would have impressed their military academies, but made them sitting ducks for anyone willing to think outside the box. "Positions," she whispered, and her team scattered through the tunnel system like water flowing through pipes. Each person knew exactly where to go, exactly what to do, and exactly how to disappear afterward. They had practiced this operation 17 times in the past 2 months. The tunnel system beneath Tokyo was a marvel of engineering that most people never realized existed. Beyond the famous subway lines, there were layers of infrastructure that went down for dozens of meters. Utility tunnels, old construction passages, drainage systems, and forgotten bunkers from World War II that had been sealed and lost to official records. Yoonji's team had spent the past year mapping every inch of these hidden spaces, connecting isolated sections, and creating a transportation network that existed completely separate from the surface world. The Vrexani had no idea they were fighting an enemy that could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish back into passages that didn't show up on any scan. She reached her position directly beneath the convoy route and carefully lifted a small periscope through a concealed opening. The Vrexani vehicles were exactly where they were supposed to be, 6 heavily armored transports carrying weapons, food, and medical supplies for the occupation forces. The alien guards looked confident, almost bored. After all, the human military had been destroyed and the population had seemingly vanished. What threat could there possibly be? "Their technology is impressive," Yoonji reported quietly into her communicator, watching the advanced alien vehicles roll past above her head. "But they think like conquerors, not like survivors." The difference was everything. The Vrexani Empire had built their entire military doctrine around the concept of honorable warfare. They believed in clear battle lines, established hierarchies, and predictable tactics that could be studied and perfected over time. Their officers went to military academies where they learned the proper way to conduct sieges, the correct formations for different types of combat, and the traditional protocols for accepting surrender from defeated enemies. It was a system that had worked perfectly for conquering 47 different worlds. Each victory had followed the same pattern: show overwhelming force, defeat the local military in direct combat, and then govern the submitted population according to established imperial law. Humanity fought like humans, chaotic, creative, and utterly ruthless when cornered. "Execute," Yoonji whispered into her comm. The first explosion came from a drainage pipe that had been packed with homemade explosives. The blast disabled the lead vehicle's engine and created a crater that blocked the convoy's forward movement. Before the alien guards could react, the second phase began. What looked like manholes covers across the street began lifting up, and humans emerged from underground with weapons that had been scavenged, modified, and adapted specifically for fighting Vrexani armor. These weren't military-grade weapons. They were improvised tools created by mechanics, engineers, and hobbyists who had figured out the weak points in alien technology through trial and error. The attack lasted exactly 90 seconds. By the time Vrexani reinforcements arrived, the convoy was destroyed, its supplies confiscated, and the attackers had vanished back into tunnels that sealed themselves behind them. Above ground, frustrated alien commanders tried to understand how an entire resistance cell could simply disappear in the middle of a city they thought they controlled. Below ground, Yoonji's team was already moving toward their next target. Lieutenant Colonel Bae Hyunwoo lay flat on his stomach atop a Tokyo skyscraper, studying the massive Vrexani command ship through his high-powered scope. The alien vessel hung in the sky like a dark moon, its hull stretching for over 2 kilometers and bristling with weapons that could level entire city blocks. Getting inside seemed about as possible as swimming to the bottom of the ocean without oxygen. His infiltration team had been watching the ship for 3 weeks, documenting every movement, every patrol pattern, every detail of how the aliens operated their floating fortress. What they had discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The Vrexani were incredibly advanced, but they were also completely predictable. "Sir, I've been thinking about the supply runs," said Corporal Moon Sora, crawling up beside him with her own scope. Before the invasion, she had been a circus performer, specializing in acrobatics and escape artistry. Now she was possibly humanity's best infiltration specialist, mainly because she could fit through spaces that normal people couldn't even see. "What about them?" Hyunwoo asked, still watching the command ship through his scope. "They happen every 6 hours, same route, same security protocol. The shuttles dock at the lower cargo bay, unload for exactly 37 minutes, then return to the surface supply depots. Sora pointed to a section of the ship's hull where small craft were constantly coming and going. They don't even scan the cargo containers once they're loaded. They just assume everything is secure because it came from their own facilities. Hyunwoo lowered his scope and looked at her. You're suggesting we hijack a supply shuttle? I'm suggesting we become the cargo, Sora replied with a grin that was equal parts excitement and insanity. They don't expect their prey to hunt them. Every species they've conquered has fought defensively, trying to protect their territory. None of them have ever tried to board the command ship and attack from the inside. The plan was so audacious that it took 2 days of careful preparation to even attempt. Sora's team had to study the alien supply containers, figure out how to modify them for human occupancy, and time everything perfectly with the shuttle schedule. One mistake would mean not just death, but probably torture as the aliens tried to figure out how humans had gotten so close to their most important vessel. They chose a supply depot on the outskirts of Yokohama that the Vrexani had converted from a human warehouse. The aliens had kept the basic structure, but added their own security systems and loading equipment. More importantly, they had grown complacent after weeks of routine operations with no human interference. Sora and her team of 6 specialists approached the depot through the storm drainage system, emerging inside the building through a floor drain that had been overlooked during the alien security sweep. The timing had to be perfect. They had exactly 18 minutes between the departure of one supply shuttle and the arrival of the next. Charges set, whispered Park Ji-hoon, their demolitions expert, as he finished preparing the shaped explosives. That would turn the Vrexani's greatest strength into their vulnerability. The aliens had built their entire command structure around centralized control. Every order, every communication, every tactical decision flowed through the command ship. If they could disrupt that system, the entire fleet would be thrown into chaos. The modified cargo containers were cramped, uncomfortable, and terrifying. Each human team member was squeezed into a space barely large enough for their body, surrounded by life support equipment that had been cobbled together from stolen alien technology and human ingenuity. If the containers were scanned too carefully, or if the shuttle's cargo bay lost atmosphere, they would die without anyone ever knowing what had happened to them. But the plan worked. The supply shuttle docked with the command ship exactly on schedule, and the automated loading systems transferred the containers to the ship's cargo bay without any additional inspection. For 37 minutes, 6 humans sat in complete darkness, inside the most heavily defended vessel in the Vrexani fleet, listening to alien voices speaking in a language they didn't understand while they prepared for the most important mission in human history. When they finally emerged from the containers, they found themselves in a cargo bay that was larger than most human buildings. The infiltration succeeded beyond all expectations because the Vrexani had never imagined that anyone would be crazy enough to try it. Using alien technology against itself, Hyunwoo's team accessed the ship's communication systems and began broadcasting false orders throughout the fleet. Surrender commands went to ships that were winning battles. Attack orders were sent to vessels that had been holding defensive positions. Navigation instructions directed some ships away from Earth, while others were told to change formation in ways that put them in each other's firing lines. Within hours, the perfectly organized Vrexani fleet had dissolved into confused factions. Some ships began firing on others, believing they were following legitimate orders to suppress mutinies. Panic spread through the command structure as officers tried to figure out why their communications were compromised and their battle plans were falling apart. The aliens' greatest strength, their rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience to authority, had become their greatest weakness. Queen Tharavel sat motionless on her command throne, staring at the dead screens that surrounded her bridge. The eternal dominion, pride of the Vrexani fleet, and terror of 47 conquered worlds, now drifted helplessly in Earth's orbit like a broken toy. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the crystalline walls, and the silence was broken only by the occasional spark from damaged systems. Her crew was gone, not dead. That would have been understandable, even honorable. Instead, they had been systematically captured by human boarding parties that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with surgical precision, and vanish back into the ship's own ventilation systems. The humans had turned her own vessel into a maze of death traps, using the ship's design against itself in ways that no Vrexani engineer had ever imagined possible. The Queen's 4 amber eyes reflected the dim emergency lights as she tried to understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong. 6 months ago, she had been the most feared military commander in this sector of the galaxy. Her fleet had been invincible, her tactics proven through centuries of successful conquest. Now she sat alone on a dead ship, surrounded by the wreckage of an empire's reputation. A soft hum filled the air, and Queen Tharavel looked up to see a human transport beam materializing in the center of her bridge. The technology was crude compared to Vrexani systems, but it worked well enough to deliver its cargo. 5 humans in military uniforms who appeared with weapons drawn and expressions that showed no fear. General Kang Mirai stepped forward from the group, her boots clicking against the polished floor as she approached the throne. She was smaller than most Vrexani children. Her technology was primitive by galactic standards, and her species had been spacefaring for less than a century. Yet somehow, this tiny human had orchestrated the first military defeat in Vrexani. "History, Your Majesty," Mirai said with the kind of military precision that the Queen had once respected in her own officers. "I believe we need to discuss terms." Tharavel studied the human general with growing fascination. There was no gloating in her voice, no triumph in her expression. She spoke like a professional soldier addressing another professional soldier, as if this entire conflict had been nothing more than a complex military exercise. "Terms?" the Queen whispered, her voice barely audible through the damaged translation systems. "You speak of terms when you have already won everything?" "Victory without understanding is just delayed defeat," Mirai replied, clasping her hands behind her back in a gesture of formal respect. "We want to make sure this doesn't happen again." The Queen's mandibles clicked weakly. "How?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her for weeks, finally finding voice. "We studied your conflicts, your wars, your weapons, your tactics. You fight primitively, chaotically. Your technology is centuries behind ours. By every calculation, every simulation, every model we possessed, you should have been conquered within days." General Mirai nodded as if she had been expecting this question. "Exactly," she said simply. "You studied our wars but missed the point entirely." She gestured to one of her aides, who activated a small holographic projector. Images began appearing in the air between them, scenes from human history that the Vrexani had analyzed during their preparation for invasion. "You saw World War II and focused on the tank battles and naval campaigns," Mirai continued, highlighting specific battles in the display. "You missed the French resistance. You studied the Korean War and analyzed the movement of armies, but you ignored what happened in the mountains and tunnels. You looked at Vietnam and saw helicopter tactics, but you didn't understand why a technologically superior force lost to farmers with improvised weapons." The holographic display shifted to show more recent conflicts, urban warfare in cities, whose names the Queen didn't recognize, fighters who disappeared into civilian populations, weapons that were built in garages and basements rather than factories. "Every conflict taught us new ways to adapt, to survive, to win against impossible odds," Mirai explained, her voice growing more intense. "We learned that honor gets you killed. We learned that following rules is a luxury you can't afford when you're fighting for survival. We learned that the enemy's strengths can become their weaknesses if you're creative enough to see the possibilities." Queen Tharavel felt something she had never experienced before: genuine respect for a species she had dismissed as primitive. "You studied us as well," she realized. "For 3 years," Mirai confirmed. "We knew someone like you would come eventually, maybe not the Vrexani specifically, but someone with overwhelming technology and traditional tactics. You expected honor. We gave you war." The Queen looked around her dead bridge one final time, then back at the small human who had brought down an empire. "What happens now?" "Now," General Mirai said, "we figure out how to make sure the galaxy doesn't need to learn these lessons the hard way." The rebuilt United Nations building looked nothing like its predecessor, Where once there had been a simple assembly hall designed for human diplomats, now there was a massive complex that could accommodate beings of dozens of different species. Environmental controls maintained separate atmospheric zones. Gravity generators created comfortable spaces for creatures from high-gravity worlds, and translation systems worked overtime to convert thoughts and concepts between species that had evolved on completely different planets. Tharavel sat in what had once been called the Observer's Gallery, watching human technicians work alongside Vrexani engineers to install the latest communication equipment. 6 months ago, she had been Queen Tharavel, Supreme Commander of the Vrexani Empire's expansion forces and terror of 47 conquered worlds. Now she was simply Tharavel, a former military officer whose titles had been stripped by the Vrexani Council in a desperate attempt to distance themselves from the disaster she had created. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her own people had abandoned her the moment her failure became public knowledge. But the humans, the primitive species she had dismissed as weaklings, had offered her something her own empire never had: a chance to learn from her mistakes and become something better. "The morning briefing is about to begin," said Dr. Park Ji-won, approaching with a tablet full of reports. The former xenobiologist had become humanity's leading expert on interspecies relations, mainly because she was one of the few people who could keep track of which species required which environmental conditions and which cultural protocols needed to be followed. Tharavel nodded and followed her into the main assembly hall, where Ambassador Kim Min-ho was preparing for another day of reshaping the galaxy's political landscape. The man who had once stood helplessly before her throne now commanded respect from species across 12 star systems, not because he threatened them, but because he offered them something they had never experienced before: genuine partnership. "Good morning, everyone," Min-ho said, addressing the mixed group of humans and aliens who now made up Earth's diplomatic corps. "Let's start with the status report from the Kralthax negotiations." President Choi Daiho, attending via holographic projection from Seoul, nodded approvingly as his Secretary of Interstellar Affairs opened the morning briefing. The title was new. 6 months ago, Earth hadn't even known that interstellar affairs existed. Now humanity was rapidly becoming the center of a new kind of galactic alliance. "The hegemony of Kralthax has agreed to our terms," Min-ho reported, scrolling through the complex legal document that had taken 3 months to negotiate. "They've heard what happened here, and they want to make sure they're on the right side if something similar happens to them." The Kralthax were a proud warrior species, much like the Vrexani had been, but they had learned from watching Earth's defense. Instead of dismissing humanity as primitive, they had recognized that humans possessed something that could be more valuable than advanced technology: the ability to fight creatively and never give up. "What about the Zephoni Collective?" asked Colonel Lee Sujin, now serving as Earth's military liaison to the new alliance. "They're still debating," Min-ho replied. "Their council is split between those who want to join us and those who think we're too dangerous to trust. Apparently some of their military strategists are concerned that if we can defeat the Vrexani, we might be a threat to them as well." Tharavel made a soft, chittering sound that the translation system rendered as mild amusement. "They're not wrong to be concerned," she said, speaking for the first time during the briefing. 6 months ago, I made the same mistake they're making now. I assumed that superior technology meant automatic victory." President Daiho's hologram turned toward her. "What would you tell them?" "That humans don't fight to conquer," Tharavel replied thoughtfully. "They fight to survive. The difference is everything." Word had spread through the galaxy with remarkable speed. Humanity had defeated the Vrexani Empire not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through pure, creative stubbornness. They had refused to play by the established rules of galactic warfare, instead creating their own rules that turned every advantage into a potential weakness. More importantly, they had shown mercy to their defeated enemies. Instead of enslaving the Vrexani or destroying their worlds, humans had offered them partnership. Former enemies were now working side by side, sharing knowledge and building something that had never existed before in this part of the galaxy, a true alliance of equals. "Ma'am," reported Captain Nam Sung-hoon, now serving as the embassy's security chief, We're getting requests for defensive partnerships from 6 more species this week. It seems like everyone who's ever been threatened by a larger neighbor wants to know how we did it. Minho smiled, remembering the terrified diplomat who had once faced Queen Tharavel's ultimatum. Schedule the meetings, he said, but make sure they understand we're not selling weapons or teaching conquest. We're offering something much more valuable. What's that? Asked Tharavel, genuinely curious. The knowledge that there's always a way to fight back, Minho replied. You just have to be willing to think differently than everyone expects. Outside the embassy windows, construction crews worked alongside engineers from a dozen different species, building humanity's first interstellar fleet. The ships were a fusion of technologies, combining human creativity with alien engineering to create vessels that were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The species that had learned to fight itself was now teaching the